In the fall of 1940, with Great Britain still unsubdued, Hitler began to shift his attention away from this campaign against Great Britain, which he'd never intended, never wanted, and to focus on what for him had always been, throughout his political career, the primary objective, and that was to be a crusade against the Soviet Union. In this, our ninth lecture in the series on the Second World War, this ninth lecture, we will now follow the planning of what came to be known as Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union, the factors that he weighed as he made this momentous decision, and the planning for what was to be the largest military operation in human history. We also were going to look at the ways in which this was not to be a traditional military campaign. This was not simply going to be a campaign for geopolitical reasons to establish Lebensraum for the Germans in the East. This was an ideological campaign, a war to the death between ideological systems, a crusade against Judeo-Bolshevism, as Hitler frequently put it. So let's begin by looking at the background to what came to be known as Operation Barbarossa. We've talked about Hitler's ideological orientation. Certainly the Soviet Union played a major role in Hitler's thinking, his ideological thinking. He had, in his earliest speeches, and certainly in Mein Kampf and later public addresses, talked about what he saw as an inevitable confrontation between the forces of civilization, which he saw as National Socialist Germany, and Asiatic Bolshevism or Judeo-Bolshevism. Hitler used these terms interchangeably. We've seen how Hitler was determined to establish Lebensraum, living space, for the Germans. That meant expansion to the east. He had originally hoped that this could be done by blitzkrieg against diplomatically isolated opponents, Poland. It certainly meant expansion toward the successor states of Eastern Europe and ultimately toward Russia, the Ukraine, and with its great breadbasket of Russia and the great mineral resources offered by the Soviet Union. These ideas were represented the very core of National Socialist ideology, and for Hitler, the war against the Soviet Union was the main event toward which the regime had been pointing from the very beginning. A war in Eastern Europe was a virtual inevitability from the time that Hitler came to power. It was what his policies were aimed toward, and now having secured, he believed, his position in Western Europe, he was impatient to turn to the East. And yet, there's something of an irony involved in this. Hitler, in Mein Kampf, had written extensively and certainly spoken extensively about the failures, the mistakes of the old imperial regime Germany, that it had lost the First War because it had engaged in a two-front war. It had allowed itself to be bogged down in this two-front war, that this was the great error of the Kaiser and his advisors, his military, and that a National Socialist regime would avoid this situation. So why now? Why, with Great Britain still unsubdued, turn to the Soviet Union in the fall of 1940 and began to give an order for his generals to begin planning an invasion for the spring of 1941? In the fall of 1940, Hitler was increasingly impatient. One sees this in a lot of his utterances to advisors, to close confidants within the National Socialist Party, to his military men. Hitler there was a growing concern. He had a growing concern about his own health. One sees this in his the so-called table talk, the Tischgespräche. He had sort of sycophantic followers who were close to him, and as he would go on in these long monologues over dinner, over lunch, would take down religiously what the Fuhrer had to say. We have these now in a series of things called Hitler's Table Talk. And in this one sees that in 1940, Hitler was afraid and talked about, well, what happens if I die before my life's work is completed? He'd originally thought about a war, the war that he now was enmeshed in, was a war that he had thought would probably come at some point in 1942, maybe 1943, but now here it was in 1940. He wanted to get this life's work accomplished. and believe in the attack on the Soviet Union. The destruction of the Soviet Union was much of what that life's work was about. And he could actually argue that the time was ripe. It is true that Great Britain was not defeated, but it was certainly eliminated as a factor on the continent. Despite Germany's setback in the Battle of Britain, England was extremely weak. It had survived, but it was certainly unable to intervene on the continent in any meaningful way. It certainly could not reverse the great tide of events that had swept across Europe in 1939-1940. It was hanging on and hanging on by its fingernails. So in this sense, Hitler could convince himself, and with some plausibility, that an attack on the Soviet Union would not mean enmeshing Germany in a two-front war. There was no real front in the West. And he believed that the Soviet Union was particularly vulnerable at just this juncture. That the longer he waited for an attack on the Soviet Union, the stronger the Soviets would become. Part of the reason for this calculation was the effect of the purges of 1937 and 1938, the purges of the Red Army that we've talked about. We've alluded to those purges, but I think one really needs to understand the scale, the scope of these purges to have some sense of how they might affect military operations. The numbers, the extent of Stalin's purges, this is staggering. Of the 80 members of the military Soviet in 1934, only 5 were still alive in 1940. All 11 deputy commissars were eliminated. Every commander of a military district, including their replacements for the first wave of victims, had been executed by the summer of 1938. 13 of the 15 Army commanders, 57 of the 85 Corps commanders, 220 of the 446 brigade commanders had been executed by 1940. But the losses didn't stop there. In fact, the greatest number of victims were among the officers from the rank of colonel down, extending all the way to the level of company commander. The Army, the Red Army, was now under the thumb of the political commissars of the Bolshevik Party. The Soviet Union possessed an army of 200 effective divisions, German intelligence estimated, organized around infantry divisions. Although the Soviets had begun to reorganize and to create armored units, armored divisions like the Germans, learning their lessons from the German blitzkrieg against Poland and in the West, the process was only just beginning in 1941. The equipment of the Red Army was lavish. The Soviets possessed more tanks and as many aircraft as the rest of the world put together. And its manpower reserves seemed virtually inexhaustible. But Hitler and the German military doubted the quality of the Red Army and its equipment. Mass, which the Russians had in excess, Hitler thought, was useless without leadership and without the proper sort of technology. It had been a truism of the old Tsarist armies that the Tsarist armies arrived too late with too much. The sense about the Red Army in 1940-41 was that it was true that it was enormous, and in that sense it was a terrifying prospect to think about this enormous military organization. On the other hand, Hitler viewed the Red Army as disorganized, its morale destroyed by the purges, and riddled with communism. The Winter War against Finland hadn't done anything to restore or change his faith in the strength of the Red Army. Indeed, the Winter War reflected that just exactly how far the disintegration of the Red Army had become, how weak it actually was, having been bogged down in this campaign against Finland. You only have to kick in the door, Hitler told General Rundstedt, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down, close quote. Hitler would say would dilate on variations of this theme over the course of the spring of 1941 and into 1942. That the Soviet regime was unpopular at home, it was corrupt, it was hated by its own subjects, and that all one had to do was to smash into the Soviet Union and the whole political structure would come apart at the seams. General Halder, who had been masterminded the campaigns in Poland and in Western Europe, was put in charge of Barbarossa, he estimated that the Soviets would be unable to resist a German invasion for more than 8 to 10 weeks. The military planning for this operation began in the summer of 1940. And by the end of July, the decision had been made to attack the Soviet Union in the spring of 1941. The operation was codenamed Barbarossa, named for the medieval German emperor who had driven to the east, famous for his Drang nach Osten, this drive to the east. In December 18th, 1940, Hitler had issued a general directive with more specific orders, and then followed those up again in January. There was some debate within the high command and with Hitler over objectives. Hitler originally had favored an attack which would focus on Leningrad in the north and another prong of the attack moving into the Ukraine, toward Kiev. Most of the military men favored some sort of more concentrated drive toward Moscow, seize the political nerve center of the Soviet Empire and destroy it that way. All agreed that the destruction of the Red Army in Western Russia was key to either one of these objectives. Finally, as planning reached its final stages, agreement was reached that the objective of the operation should not be cities, specific geographic points, not necessarily Moscow or Leningrad or Kiev in the Ukraine, but rather the key objective, the central objective, the mission stated for the German army with its invasion of the Soviet Union was the destruction of the Red Army in Western Russia. This, both Halder and Hitler were convinced, could be accomplished within 2 months, maybe a little longer, maybe a little less if things broke their way. In one sense, the Germans, there was a geographic notion to this. The Germans didn't have any intention of occupying all of the Soviet Union or driving to the Urals and so on. A general line, a line running from Archangel on the Arctic Ocean in the north to Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea in the south. This is geographically speaking, this is a line of extraordinary length and would require a military operation of extraordinary proportions to achieve. It would, in short, be the most ambitious military operation in human history. 3 army groups were assembled for this operation. Army Group North. Now, I said these groups don't necessarily have geographic objectives. It is to destroy the Red Army in Western Russia. But for general purposes, Army Group North was directed through the Baltic states with a general direction toward Leningrad. Army Group Center would be focused on a drive headed largely toward Moscow. And Army Group South was aimed toward Kiev and into the agriculture-rich Ukraine. The Germans assembled 145 divisions. 102 of those were infantry units. 19 were armored divisions. 14 motorized infantry units were all assembled. 2,500 tanks, 2,700 airplanes, and over 1 million troops assembled for this operation. It was an extraordinary logistical feat. These troops were moved from Western Europe to the east, assembled, and prepared to launch this invasion in May of 1941. There was one other aspect of the logistical organization for the invasion, which, as the invasion began, didn't so much strike Europeans, but when American military people got a hold of the information and the data from the invasion, there was one striking aspect of it, of German preparations, that General Marshall and others in Washington saw as more striking than the 2,700 tanks, more striking than the 1 million troops, the 2,700 airplanes. The German army moving to the Soviet Union requisitioned 10,000 horses. For American military thing, there was a sense of, well, where are the trucks? What are these horses for? What are the horses to be used for? And we'll come back to this in a bit. The original invasion date was set for May 15th, 1941. At that time, The High Command calculated that the spring rains would have subsided and that the turf on the terrain in the Soviet Union would be firm enough to support the blitzkrieg operation that the Germans planned to unleash. But in October of 1940, Mussolini, against Hitler's fervent pleas to the contrary, had invaded Greece. It was one more ill-advised military operation on the part of the Italians. Hitler had tried to convince Mussolini not to do this. He thought it would be a terrific blunder. He didn't need his southern flank in the Balkans to be in question, and didn't want British involvement in the Balkans at this sensitive moment when Germany was preparing for this enormous, colossal attack on the Soviet Union. The Italian operations in Greece were a fiasco from the word go. The Italians had jumped off from Italian-occupied Albania, attacked into Greece. The Greeks, like the Finns before them in the Russo-Finnish War, fought with great tenacity, not only defeated the Italians in Greece, but drove them back into Albania and then followed them into Albania. The Greeks became, in the spring of 1941, the same sort of heroes around the world that the Finns had become, had been a bit earlier. Finally, Hitler decided that the situation in the Balkans had become so unstable that he needed to send troops in to stabilize it. Therefore, in April of 1941, the Germans launched an invasion of both Greece and Yugoslavia. This is usually cited as a key variable in explaining subsequent events, particularly the postponement of Operation Barbarossa. Hitler postpones it until late June in order to bail Mussolini out in the Balkans. Since, as we know, the snows would come in the late fall in the Soviet Union, and German troops would become bogged down in the snow west of Moscow, this lost month of campaigning in the spring is often seen as being really crucial. And so this diversion of German troops into the Balkans, a key explanatory variable in the failure of the Germans to take Moscow or to drive the Soviet Union out of the war in 1941. But I don't think this holds up very well. It is true that involvement in the Balkans did divert German attention. There was a postponement of Operation Barbarossa, but I think probably more than Mussolini's misadventures in Greece, the weather in Eastern Europe was far more important. The spring of 1941 was unusually wet. In fact, I think, just looking at the weather in Eastern Europe over the last spring, where there was enormous flooding in Poland and in Eastern Europe. It was the wettest winter since 1941, spring I should say. It was unusually wet and the rivers in Poland were flooded until early June. So tanks needed hard terrain, the roads in the Soviet Union were primitive, and Hitler decided to postpone the attack until June. The new date for the invasion was June 22nd, 1941. It was 129 years to the day after Napoleon had launched his disastrous invasion of Imperial Russia in 1812. It's interesting that as the Germans began to mass troops along their frontier, now remember the German-Russian frontier is in Poland now. Poland is basically vanished. So Russian troops have moved west. Soviet intelligence was very good. The Soviets possessed the best spy system in the world at this point. And Stalin had been receiving intelligence reports from a spy ring in Japan, Soviet spy ring in Japan, which indicated that the Germans were moving troops to the east and planning an attack. Churchill's information from the breaking of the German code, the British and the United States were providing the Soviets with information to suggest that the Germans were up to no good. In fact, they were planning an invasion of the Soviet Union. And Stalin steadfastly refused to heed these warnings. Among other things, Stalin was quite concerned that what Churchill, in his desperation, was trying to do was simply stir up trouble between the Soviet Union and its ally, Germany. He didn't want. He was afraid that that Churchill was simply being wily and shrewd and trying to provoke some sort of incident between Germany and the Soviet Union to break that alliance to save Britain. And as a consequence, he did not inform his military commanders in Western Poland about German troop movements. Even the local commanders began receiving reports, indications, German flyovers that were clearly unusual. There was a case of a German deserter who had gone across the lines and reported to the local Soviet commanders that a huge military operation was in the offing, but to no avail. As the Germans began their preparations, the huge logistical preparations for this invasion, they also began preparations of another sort, preparations to indoctrinate their troops for the campaign against the Red Army. This was to be a war unlike the war against Poland. It was going to be a war radically different from the war that had just been conducted in Western Europe. This was going to be an ideological conflict, a war to the finish. A decree had been issued by Hitler in the late days of May, indicating to the high command that they should prepare the troops for the sort of war they were about to embark upon. And in the last days before the invasion, a series of directives were drafted by the high command and National Socialist officials to be read to German troops, all German troops going into the Soviet Union. I'd like to quote from them. They give us a chilling preview of what this war in the East would be. In the struggle against Bolshevism, one of these directives read, "We must not assume that the enemy's conduct will be based on principles of humanity or of international law. In particular, hateful, cruel, and inhuman treatment of our prisoners is to be expected from political commissars of all kinds as the real carriers of resistance. The troops must be advised, number one, in this struggle, consideration and respect for international law with regard to these elements are wrong. They are a danger for our own security and for the rapid pacification of the conquered territory. Two, the originators of barbaric Asiatic methods of warfare are the political commissars of the Bolshevik Party. Accordingly, measures must be taken against them immediately and with full severity. Accordingly, whether captured in battle or offering resistance, they are in principle to be disposed of by arms." This was the infamous Commissar order issued by the high command, by Hitler actually, and the high command to the troops. On June 4th, that order was elaborated in another fashion for troops going into the Soviet Union. It stated, "Bolshevism is the mortal enemy of the National Socialist German people. Germany's struggle is directed against this destructive ideology and its carriers. This struggle demands ruthless and energetic measures against Bolshevik agitators, guerrillas, saboteurs, Jews, and the complete elimination of every active or passive resistance." The wording of that is very important. Troops going into the Soviet Union were told there are four you're going to encounter in addition to the Red Army, four other sources of resistance: Bolshevik agitators, guerrillas, saboteurs, and Jews. Well, Bolshevik agitators didn't exactly show up and register themselves with the oncoming German army. Saboteurs obviously don't, guerrillas don't. But the one group in that list that proved to be extraordinarily vulnerable was the Jewish community of Eastern Poland and the Soviet Union. And they now become targets. A few days after the invasion began, these directives were followed up by a series of others. Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau, commander of the 6th Army, issued another statement to elaborate on this, which Hitler saw as being capturing particularly the essence of combat against the Soviets. With respect to the conduct of troops toward the Bolshevik system, vague ideas are still widely prevalent, Reichenau wrote. The most essential aim of this campaign against the Jewish Bolshevist system is the complete crushing of its means of power and the extermination of Asiatic influence in the European region. This poses tasks for the troops that go beyond the one-sided routine of conventional soldiering. In the Eastern region, the soldier is not merely a fighter according to the rules of the art of war, but also the bearer of an inexorable national idea and the avenger of all bestialities inflicted upon the German people and its racial kin. Therefore, the soldier must have full understanding for the necessity of a severe but just atonement on Jewish subhumanity. An additional aim in this is to nip in the bud any revolts in the rear of the army, which, as experience proves, have always been instigated by Jews. Now these, what I've just quoted, these are not internal National Socialist documents. These are directives issued by the German army for the conduct of its troops in the Soviet Union, acting on what they thought was the will of the Fuhrer. The Soviet Union had not signed the Geneva Accords. And so, in one sense, the rules of war, of international law, were not going to apply. But what the German army was being told heading into the Soviet Union was this is basically going to be a war without rules. That this is a fight to the finish, an utter, complete, ideological conflict in which no quarter will be given. Don't anticipate one, and don't give one yourself. Just a little after daybreak on June 22nd, 1941, a train traveling west from Soviet-occupied territory crossed a bridge. It was a delivery of raw materials to the Germans. The German troops that were crouching on the other side of the river watched as the train came across the bridge, making sure that this last delivery of raw materials was made. It crossed the bridge, and just after sunup, the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa. They caught the Russians utterly by surprise, utterly unprepared. By pushing the frontier to the west, Stalin may have bought time, but he exposed those units to exactly the sort of large-scale pincer movements that the Germans had perfected. Within the first 24 hours, the Germans would inflict tens of thousands of casualties on the Russians, would take close to 100,000 prisoners, and the Red Air Force, the Soviet Air Force, which was the largest in the world, was caught almost entirely on the ground. 1,200 Soviet aircraft were destroyed in less than 24 hours, almost all of them on the ground. When on the following day the Soviet Air Force ordered a counterattack with Soviet bombers, they took off from positions that the Germans already knew, and they were annihilated in the air. The Soviets would now confront a German army with terrific material, with a plan that they believed they were convinced would work, now without air cover and without the sort of political support that they believed was necessary, without the intelligence that was crucial. Within 24 hours, the German army had inflicted upon the Soviets a bigger defeat than the Germans had inflicted upon any of their opponents in the West. Everything had gone exactly as Hitler had anticipated. The Red Army appeared to be exactly the sort of weak, politically corrupt, inefficient organization that his military had suggested that it would be. You only have to kick in the door, Hitler had said, and the whole rotten structure will come crumbling down. There was one other thing that Hitler had said, though, that was also very prophetic. Convinced as he was of victory, he also added, in war, anytime when you launch an operation, you go to war, it's like opening the door into a dark room. You think you know what's there. You think you know where the furniture is arranged, but you never really know until you step inside. The Germans had just stepped inside Soviet-occupied territory on June 22nd, and the Soviets were not to be the only ones who were surprised. We'll take this up in our next lecture.